Hey everybody, this is Josh,
And this is Dean.
and here we are again with another installment of Dean and Josh Write Fiction, Finding an Agent. And so this week we're going to get caught up on what Dean's been up to and what I've been up to, and talk a little bit about what we've been reading. And before we jump off into that, I want to remind everyone to like and subscribe and leave a comment down below. Ask any questions if you have questions, and we'll work them into one of our future segments, but we'd love to hear from you. So with that said, let's go ahead and kick it off. Dean, what do you got for us?
Well, I got as we've said, or as I've said in the past, I've been sending out snail mail submissions to agents, and I finally got a response, one of my self-addressed stamped envelopes. And by the way, that's my mailing address, not my home address, so you can't find me. And well, big surprise, rejection. But it was nice to know that at least the snail mail made it to them, and at least got some kind of response to know that it was received.
So are you going to take the Stephen King approach and wallpaper your wall with your rejections?
Is that what he does?
I don't know. That's what he claimed to do early on. I think he said he had a nail on his wall, and he just would paste them, stick each one on the nail or something.
No,
something like that.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. I don't know. I was probably just gonna, I don't know, put it somewhere in my room and eventually throw it away. But yeah. I'll think about that. Maybe I could make a nice paper mache something out of it.
Yeah, there you go.
So that was that. Like I said, I really like the old-fashioned way of sending out snail mail submissions. So I'll keep doing that and see how it goes.
All right. Well, on my end, I had mentioned in previous weeks that I had a short story out on submission and was waiting to get a response on that. And I finally got a response on that. And like Dean, big surprise, also a rejection. And it was pretty short and sweet, very form letter, although it was email, but it was very impersonal. It didn't even say Dear Josh or Dear Mr. Craven at the beginning of it. It was literally just a cut and paste block paragraph of thanks, but no thanks.
Keep you're writing. Right. Yeah, you're right. Mine's the same way. It says Dear Author. I didn't even notice that. That's even more of a kick in the nuts.
Yeah. It's a little depressing, but at least I know the fate for that story, at least on that submission anyway. So that one can go back into the collection, and I can keep working on that collection to submit to small presses that take unsolicited manuscripts. So anyway, that's that. And that's really about all I've been up to in the past week, other than writing. Dean and I had exchanged stories through our writers group, as we'd mentioned before, and we had done the feedback and critique on that. And so I spent the last week working on the feedback that I'd received from Dean and incorporating that into the story. And that story is also in the collection that I have. So getting that one finalized and polished up was pretty important. So that was also part of my week.
Yeah, me as well. And I really was glad we got back to doing those submissions to each other and reading critique. I think that really helps me with my motivation and thinking about writing.
That pretty much gets us up to date for what we've had going on the last week. So I guess we can turn to what we've been reading, and I'll go ahead and start off with that. I had mentioned before that I was reading The Mailman by Bentley Little, and I finished reading that book. That book, I was reading it on the Kindle, but in paperback it was about 411 pages. And it took me a little bit to get through it. I think reading on the Kindle probably made it a little bit longer because I can't read for as long on the Kindle. My eyes get tired looking at the illuminated screen. And so I can only read for a little while each night, maybe a chapter or two. And then I usually end up having to put it down. But this book was interesting. I don't feel like it finished super strong. I don't know. I think that's kind of a common occurrence, though. It seems like, I guess the more I write and the more that I read, the more I kind of pick up on endings that I don't think are very strong. And I don't know why that is. Of course, Stephen King's notorious for not having a strong ending to his books. He's a great storyteller. He's not a great story ender. And I don't know, maybe that's true for a lot of writers. But with this particular book, the mailman was this malevolent supernatural force in the book. And then it kind of turned out towards the end that he couldn't really actually hurt anyone himself. And I guess I should stop and say there's spoilers here. So I'm going to go ahead and drop some spoilers. The mailman couldn't really hurt anyone. Like, the limitation to his power was he was able to manipulate things supernaturally, but he could only really instigate violence between other people. And it was more like a psychological terror that caused people to react. And so he could either provoke people to commit violence against other people, or there's a few people that he, I guess, manipulated them into committing suicide. And so there were some horrific things that happened as a result of what the mailman was doing, but he himself was not actually able to hurt anyone. So towards the end, when there became some scenes where there was some one-on-one conflict directly with the mailman, it was a little bit anticlimactic, because like, you quickly realized he couldn't actually do anything to anybody. And at the end of the book, they were trying to get rid of him. And the way they ended up getting rid of him was, the protagonist was a school teacher. And, so he kind of had this theory, that the mailman derived his power from delivering the mail and people consuming the mail and reacting to the mail. And so his grand theory was to somehow convince every single person in this town to completely ignore the mail. And every single person in this town no longer opened any of their mail. I don't know how this would actually ever work in real life, but he convinced everyone in the entire town at this assembly to no longer check their mail or read their mail or send a mail or have any interaction with the mail. And they essentially emotionally starved this malevolent mailman of his supernatural powers, and he kind of withered away and left town.
So the mailman is basically Mark Zuckerberg, and
yeah, maybe so. Although
it sounds like Facebook pretty much.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe so. It's kind of funny, but yeah, it was kind of anticlimactic. Like, there was no real ultimate showdown. I mean, there was like a couple of face-to-face conflicts with the mailman, but they didn't result in anything because they couldn't kill him and he couldn't hurt them. And so it was just kind of this, then it became this war of wills and attrition, where he kept delivering the mail and no one would read it. And the more that no one read the mail, the more he became like emaciated and just kind of withered away. And that was just kind of the end of it, which, like I said before, the writing was good. There was a couple of moments that were legitimately pretty, scary or a little bit creepy. They kind of got my pulse going a little bit before I realized that the mailman couldn't actually hurt anyone. Like, before you knew that, there was a couple of moments where, there was some isolated events with the mailman and you thought somebody might die, and then nobody actually did die from an interaction with the mailman. I don't know, it just seemed kind of weird. And this was Bentley Little's second book that was published as well. I didn't realize that at first, but his first book, I believe, was called The Revelation. And it's an interesting story because The Revelation was actually his thesis when he was in college. Like, his thesis paper was to write a novel. And that book ended up getting published. That was his first published book. And then The Mailman was the second one. And so maybe some of his later books are a little bit better. I'm not sure. But this book was well written and it was interesting. I just kind of found the story and some of it a little bit weirdly lacking.
I wonder if it's because when the author started the novel, he didn't know how it was going to end, and so he had to think up something at the end.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe so. But especially early on like I said, this book was written about 30 years ago. And so, you take that into account. you take out all of the fiction that's been written in the last 30 years, so you don't have to worry about repeating the endings of books that have done in the last 30 years. So you've got a little bit more, I guess, flexibility there with how you could end a book. Plus, it was early in his career when generally writers have more creative sparks and creative ideas, and it just seems a little weird that he wouldn't have had a better ending in mind or to execute that early on in his career. And of course, I sound, like I'm criticizing the guy. He's a much better writer than I am. He's much more successful than I am. So I'm not sure that it's my place to criticize him. But the ending just seemed a little odd and didn't quite work for me. I don't know, a bit of a letdown when you have a book that has this much violence and horror in the plot, and then at the end, that was kind of the resolution for it. I don't know, it just seemed a little odd to me. And I kind of found myself reading the last couple of chapters just to get done with it and move on. And I would probably read something else by Bentley Little, give him another chance and see if there's something else that he wrote later that I liked better. But in reading reviews on a lot of his books, it looks like a lot of his books kind of follow similar patterns. Like you have a small town in Arizona, you have what's normally considered an everyday mundane entity or person like a mailman or a store or what have you. And then he turns that into something malevolent that manipulates the society and brings it to the brink of catastrophe or what have you. And I think he does that a lot with his plots. I don't know if some others might be executed a little bit better than the mailman. So I'd be willing to give it another chance because his writing was good. But this particular one, like if I was rating it on a scale of 10, I'd probably give it a 6. So.
Well, that's too bad that it didn't have a better ending. I mean, the premise sounded pretty good. He may have just not been able to come up with a good ending.
Yeah, I think I got talked over you a little bit there, but yeah, I think you're right. The premise was pretty good, and all in all, it's still a good exercise. You read something, and even if you don't love it, it kind of gives you some guidance on maybe what you don't want to do when you're writing your stories. So there's still something to be learned from stuff, even if you don't love it. But anyway, yeah, it's a good book. Like I said, he writes really well, and I would definitely try something else by him. That just probably wasn't my favorite one. But what about you? What have you been doing?
Well, I I got this subscription to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And the reason I think in the back of my mind I got a subscription to them, I got a 2-year subscription, which I don't know if that was a mistake now. But I submitted a short story a couple of years ago to the magazine. No, it was probably more like 5 years ago, to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And whoever was there clearly read it, and they sent me a very personalized rejection letter. It was still a rejection letter, but it was the best rejection letter I've ever gotten, and it was clear that they read it and gave it some thought. And so I guess out of respect for that, I got a subscription to them. A lot of the stories, though, turn out to be, left-wing political bias. And so that's kind of disappointing. But now that I've got it, I'm forcing myself to read it. But there was a story in this edition, which is the May-June edition of this year, and I was pretty impressed by it. It was written by an author her name is Stephanie Cranner, and it's called A Father's Hand. And I didn't detect any left-wing political agenda in it. It's basically about a kid with a robot that has raised him, and so he thinks of the robot as his father. And there's been some kind of background long before the story started of humans versus robots, war, and mostly humans and robots have mostly wiped each other out. So it's got, the typical Frankenstein type, science fiction story, which is well trod. And then the kind of the problem in the story, the kid's problem is this: when his father broke down and his, robot computer software or whatever broke down, and the kid was holding the robot's hand when this happened. And so like the robot won't release his grip on his hand. Now the robot will follow him wherever he goes, so he can walk around, and the robot just automatically follows him around. But the robot no longer has any cognitive ability. And the kid can't get his hand out, and the grip is so tight that his hand is slowly dying, like his hand is going gangrene. And so he's got to try and figure out, well, first of all, he's dealing with the grief of what he views as his father dying, the robot. And then he's got to figure out how to get the grip, off of his hand so that he doesn't die too. And the story is basically about that. It's a short story. And I'd say things happen to the kid more than he makes them happen, because the resolution is kind of out of his control. But it is a happy ending. He does survive. So, I just thought it was, a good story. Probably brings up questions like, what does it mean to be alive? And also, what does it mean to love someone? And, it's pointed out that the robot didn't really love him. It just had its programming, to act that way towards him. But, I think even in the story, it's mentioned, well, you could say that we're just, combinations of atoms, and, do the neural pulses that we love each other. Does that really mean anything more than just those neural pulses, and does it make sense to really just reduce it all to some kind of mechanistic thing like that? And does that make a difference? Like, is that still love? So pretty good story overall. Here's another thing about her. They're saying this is her first published story. She's a technical writer and speculative fiction author living in Pittsburgh. And this is her first professional publication. So this was her first publication.
Yay, good for her. Congratulations.
Science fiction magazine. It sounds like she's written stuff, self-published, and she's got an online social media presence and whatnot.
That's pretty awesome. Good for her. What was her name again?
Stephanie Craner, Kraner. I'm sure someone, if they want to Google her, they can, I'm sure, find. I've got some notes there that I've written on it, but
yeah,
I'm sure you can Google her and find her if you want to read more of her stuff. And at least that story, I didn't detect any left-wing political agenda on her part, and she has a male child as the protagonist, and it's dealing with kind of relationships between fathers and sons, although it's more just really generally between parent and child. But the kid refers to the robot as his father, and apparently the robot had saved him from being killed by other robots. So I guess there's a little, don't judge a book by its cover, but I wouldn't really call that like a left-wing political agenda. I just call that, kind of human values.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting to me. The whole concept that you explained with the father robot dying and the grip on the child, like I'm kind of interested in that. I wouldn't mind reading that because, as someone whose father has died somewhat recently, I think everyone kind of struggles with that, even when your dad dies,
they're still
your father. Yeah, your father has a big presence in your life, and even when they're gone, you struggle with, what is that presence and what does it mean and how much hold does it maintain over your life? And so
that's a great point. I'd even thought of that connection, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and so this whole thing with the robot, maintaining this grip on this child, yeah, that's a really good metaphor. I'm actually really interested. I kind of wouldn't mind reading that story.
Yeah, I'll hand it off to you when I finish it. And this, I usually read about half of these, and I like to read them too, just to kind of see where things are at. But I was impressed by her. I thought she did a good job.
That's good. That's good to find somebody like that you like what they write and you like, their message, and doesn't feel like you're being browbeaten with the political agenda.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not sure that I have anything else for this week. Do you have anything else you wanted to talk about?
I think I've said what I need to say.
All right. Well, on that note, then we'll kind of wrap this up and encourage everyone to like and subscribe and leave us a comment down below. And in the meantime, we'll catch you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Sorry, I got to start over.
I don't know why that's backwards. It's really weird.
Ah, shit. All right.
We'll get better at this as we go, I guess. And
What's going into the sausage here?
there's definitely some reflection off my head. Yeah, I may end up in federal prison